Okay, we've made it to the end, the last video of the SAT Foundation series, video number 10. Thanks for sticking with me this long if you've done so far. So, we are going to talk about in this video grammar strategies, how to deal with the grammar multiple choice questions. So as a quick review about what you'll expect, assuming, of course, that there are no experimental sections to be wary of, you've got two main sections that you're going to be dealing with. One is 25 minutes, 35 questions. That's the longest one, obviously. And then you got a little 10-minute 14 question section, and that's always section 10. Section 10. And if you have an experimental, it'll be that extra one. But most of the time, you're just going to have two. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is there's an order of difficulty with all the questions except for the improving paragraphs, those little 5 questions at the end, or 6 questions at the end of this section. So, because of an order of difficulty, keep in mind that the first third are easy, second third are medium, third are hard or difficult. So keep that in mind as you go, that kind of test knowledge or remembering where you are on the test is so critical because it'll affect how you approach a question. If you're dealing with an easy question, then you should get it pretty quickly and it should be pretty obvious. If you're dealing with a hard question, you want to be very careful of traps and tricks and all that junk. Okay. Also to remind you what I talked about in section or video 8, which is the key to avoid, and that is relying on your ear too much. Now, of course, you want to use your ear because it's a valuable tool. I don't want to tell you not to rely on your ear at all, but we have to be very careful about relying on it too much because ETS, the College Board, will know that we're going to rely on our ear to pick out grammar mistakes, and then they will exploit that, as I talked about in video 8. So if you have any questions on what I mean by this, go back to video 8. All right, let's talk briefly about the 3 kinds of question types that you'll see in the grammar sections, the writing sections. The first is improving sentences, and there'll be 24 questions total throughout the entire SAT on improving sentences. And these are the long ones where you have to essentially rewrite a sentence. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with this is that there's an order of difficulty with these, as I mentioned above. They're also long. They're also long because you have to read them. They take a while to read. So I might suggest to do these last. And at the end of this, I'll give you a discussion about how you might approach all the questions of the big 35 question section. But as a general tip, I might say do these last just because they take a long time. And you don't want to dump a lot of questions into these improving sentences, especially the hards. You don't want to spend 5 or 10 minutes working on the hards when you've got a bunch of questions to go. So I might suggest doing these last and then coming back to them at the end. One other tip is that choice A is no error. And you should expect to pick this 1/5 of the time, right? Because there are 5 choices, which translates for every improving sentences section, there'll be around 2 to 3 A's. Now, of course, this will vary. It could be less, it could be more, but this is where you're at. If you have 0 A's, you probably made a mistake. If you have 7 A's, you probably also made a mistake. So just keep all that in mind. Another general tip for these improving sentences, and we'll see an example of this in one of the practice problems we do in a little bit. General tip is to, if all things are equal, if the grammar is, if say you're stuck between C and D, if the grammar on both is okay, there's nothing necessarily wrong with either in terms of the grammar, then you want to go with the one that's shorter, cleaner, and in general more concise. That's just a general rule of thumb. The fewer words there are, the cleaner, the more concise it is, the better. And that's, all things being equal, the choice you're going to go with. Error IDs. Okay, so there's about 18 of them in the entire test. These are relatively fast. There's an order of difficulty here too, but these are pretty super fast because you only have to read the sentence and then pick out the piece of the sentence that's wrong. You don't have to replay. With these, you kind of have to read the sentence over and over again 5 times. This, you just pick the piece that's wrong, you circle it, you move on. So these are fast. So I suggest actually doing these first. Do these first. Because you can get these done quick, you won't really be losing a lot of time, and you'll make sure to hit them when you can. One other mention about both of these. So let's see, will this fit on the screen? Almost. So right here, these 2 question types, it's not about style. So it's not about whether you would write something differently or not. Sure, you might want to, you may figure that writing it a different way would sound better, or, it would just be cleaner, or more appropriate for the sentence, but it's not about style at all. It's about pure grammar errors. You're looking for mistakes. You're not looking for, oh, this could be written this way, so that's probably going to be the answer. You don't want to do that. You want to look for actual mistakes, and that's why below we're going to go through some actual grammar errors that you want to look for. Improving paragraphs. So these are really short. There's only 6 of them. They're at the end of that long section. One other tip, they're generally only easy and medium. There's no order of difficulty, but they're generally only easy and medium, so these should be within pretty much everybody's wheelhouse. That's why my recommendation... Oh, by the way, they're also a combination of grammar, of course, and reading comp, because you're actually going to have a paragraph or an essay, a little mini essay that you're going to have to read and answer questions based off of, and you're going to see that it's going to be very similar to the reading comprehension when you're answering questions based off of a paragraph, but also you also have to, since it's a grammar section, you have to worry about grammar. What I like to say is, imagine you're helping a friend revise an essay. That's kind of what they're trying to capture here with these kinds of questions. Here, unlike the other 2 sections, it is about style. It is about how something sounds. It is about how you could write it better. So that's why these 2 are not about style. It's about pure error. Here, of course, pure error matters, but style matters. How something is written, how it expresses an idea really does matter as well. My recommendation overall for how to approach especially the 35 question section, is do the error IDs first, because they're quick, and you have an order of difficulty. You know which ones are easy, which ones medium, which ones are difficult. Then knock out these 6 quick questions because they're easies and mediums. They're within our wheelhouse. Then spend the rest of your time knocking through these improving sentences. And what that will do is the last 5 minutes of the 25 minutes are about where you're going to be touching on the hards, and that's good, right? We don't want to spend a ton of time on these hards. If we do them, we want to do them pretty quick. We don't want to get stuck on them. So that's why if we leave them to last, it'll be the most efficient for the 35 question section. All right, now we've talked about the actual kinds of questions that are on the test. Let's talk about the error types. These are the categories of errors that you're going to see appear again and again and again on the grammar section. So if we learn them, we learn how to recognize them for the purpose of the SAT, we'll be all set. The major error type that we're going to see appear again and again throughout these 6 questions, now not 6 examples. Now, not all the errors are of this kind, but a large amount of them are. And that is agreement. And by agreement, it simply means that all the parts of the sentence, whether it's an error ID or improving sentence, have to work with each other, have to match each other, have to agree with each other. And we're going to see with these error types to come that there are some specific agreement errors that we'll see, but this applies in general. The entire sentence must be a cohesive unit. Grammatically, for the improving paragraphs, it'll have to be cohesive stylistically. So this is the thing we're going to see again and again. So let's move to the first kind of error that we'll see on the test. And that error is verbs. They're related to verbs, and this is it's certainly the number 1. This is just the first one. I didn't mean number 1. This is not an order of prevalence, but this case, I think it is. This is probably the most important one to know because it's the foundation of grammar in many ways, at least English grammar. So let's take a look at this first one. The newly elected Prime Minister, to the dismay of opponents from other parties, have argued for the strict regulation of campaign financing. Okay, so let's see. The newly elected. So nothing on the surface, by the way. First thing we do with these, remember, we see, does anything jump out at us? Do we hear anything weird? In this case, we don't really, so let's go through them piece by piece. The newly elected. Any problem with that? No. Newly elected, no worries. This is an adverb, it's modifying this adjective, no worries. Newly elected Prime Minister, to the dismay of opponents. Okay, this is an expression, so this is an idiom. This is fine. Nothing wrong with this. Opponents of other parties have argued. Now, wait a minute. Have argued. This is a verb, right? What is the noun? This is the thing you always have to ask yourself with verbs. What is the noun that goes with have argued? Who is doing the arguing here? Is it the parties? Well, the parties is next to it, but that's not the thing that's doing the arguing. It's the Prime Minister who's doing the arguing, right? The newly elected Prime Minister have argued for blah, blah, blah. So it's the minister who's doing the arguing. Now, the have, is that singular or plural? Well, that's plural, right? We have, they have. What is the noun? The noun is singular. So wait a minute, we have an agreement error. This is an example of VA. Verb agreement. This is a classic verb agreement error, where what they do is they take the verb, they separate it from its noun, so you can't quite tell immediately that there's a problem. The other thing they'll often do is the noun right before the verb is going to be perfectly declined or conjugated, right? Parties have. That's fine if parties were the subject to this verb, but it's not. It's Prime Minister. So actually, it should be the newly elected newly elected prime minister has argued. So the answer here is C. So they put a bunch of junk in between these two, and they'll end that junk with a noun that matches that verb. So we have to always, when we see verbs, make sure that we see that this verb goes with this noun, not with this noun, and therefore should be conjugated correctly. So the answer here is C. Let's move on to 5. Studies have suggested that eating nuts, almonds in particular, might help to lower blood cholesterol levels in humans and reducing the risk of heart disease by protecting the blood vessels. So this is an example of when you might hear this as an issue, and the issue here is with C, and that's the answer. This is an example of what I call verb form errors. Often it's confusing the infinitive version of a verb, so to reduce, versus the gerund, which is the ing version of it. That's often what they'll do. Here, we should have something like, might help to lower blood cholesterol levels in humans and to reduce, right? To lower, to reduce, not reducing. So the answer here is C. And this is verb form. You often will see these in the, not only in the error IDs, but often in the improving sentences is where you'll see them the most, really. Let's move on to the next. Winslow Homer, one of America's foremost artists, spent his last 27 years and painted on the scenic Maine coast. Now, nothing sounds horrific at first, but we might see that there's something weird here. And if we look closely at this, we'll see what it is. Winslow Homer spent his last 27 years. Well, this end separates the spent and the painted. It makes it sound like he did two things. The first thing he did was spend his last 27 years, and at the same time he painted. That's weird, right? How do you spend your last 27 years? What you would be doing is you'd be spending your last 27 years painting on the scenic Maine coast. So this would be an example of a verb form error, or even a sentence structure later. We'll see sentence structure error. We'll see that kind of error later. But this is a verb form error, right? It should be something like spent his last 27 years painting on the scenic Maine coast. So we can get rid of A. Does anything else make the same error? Let's see. Nothing really makes the same error, so let's look at the rest of the choices. B, spent his last 27 years having painted. Not great. C, spent his 27 years painting. Yes, that's what we want. D, having spent his last 27 years doing his painting. That's awkward and ugly. E, spending his last 27 years painting. Not terrible, but we need to have the spent still. So the answer here is C. Alrighty, let's move on to number 18. This is again verb form, VF. VF. Until recently, most people entering politics feel that the loss of privacy was a fair price to pay for the chance to participate in policymaking. So if you're following the pattern, you probably can tell there's something wrong with B because it's a verb. And there is something wrong with B. What should it be? Well, this is what we call a tense error. Tense is just whether it's in the present, the past, or the future. If you look at the sentence, it says, until recently, most people entering politics feel. Well, this implies a past tense, right? So this should actually be felt. Until recently, most people entering politics felt that loss of privacy. So this is an example of agreement in the sense that all the verb tenses should agree with the rest of the sentence. Since this implies past tense, this has got to be past tense. So that is it for the verb errors. That's one of the major types of errors you'll see on the test. So keep that in mind when you're looking through all these kind of questions, to always pay attention to those verbs. See if they're conjugated correctly. See if they're referring to the right subject. See if they're in the right form. See if they're in the right tense. See if they agree with the sentence as a whole. Let's move on to error category number 2. This is pronouns. So pronouns are the things like he, she, it. They're things they're nouns that replace other nouns. So let's look at some examples of the errors you might see. Zookeepers have expanded one's definition of care to include concern for animals' mental state as well as for its physical well-being. Well, we look at this. One is a pronoun, right? One would replace a noun. Whenever we see a pronoun in any of these sentences, we want to say, all right, what noun is it replacing? In this case, it seems that one is replacing zookeepers. So is this a good agreement? No. This is an example of PA, or pronoun agreement. What should the pronoun be that replaces zookeepers? It's not ones, that's singular first off, and that's kind of general. We need they, or something like their in this case. Zookeepers have expanded their definition of care. So we can get rid of A. Anything else make the same error? Yep, B. Ones is here as well, so we can get rid of B. C. Expand their no. Zookeepers expand their definition of care? No. D. Zookeepers expanding the definition of care to include? No, it's a run-on or fragment. Zookeepers have expanded their definition of care to include perfect. It changes the thing that's wrong. And often what you want to do is not change too much. You want to keep the sentence as close to the original as possible, except for making the change that you need to make. So in this case, the answer here is E, because it fixes the pronoun agreement error. Let's look at 23. The survey indicated that workers living in the United States hope that his or her wages will keep pace with the rising cost of living. So his or her, that's a pronoun, right? His or her. What should it replace? Well, it should replace workers, right? Workers is plural. His or her, this is actually singular, right? Because we have or separating two singular pronouns. That makes this thing singular. So what should this be? This should be, again, their. The survey indicated that workers in the United States hope that their wages. So the answer here is B, another PA error. Let's look at 25. Last summer, when Mary's aunt and uncle flew from Turkey to visit the relatives and tour the United States, Mary invited Zendaya and I to her house to meet them. Now, we have a pronoun here, I. Now, this is an example of a case error. Now, this is the thing of, okay, should it be Zendaya and I or Zendaya and me? And the best way to do these questions is just to cross out everything but the pronoun you're interested in, and then see how it sounds, and that will tell you. So, Mary invited I to her house? No. Mary invited me to her house, right? That's how you can tell whether this is correct. The case is right. The case is whether it's just I or me. You just remove everything else and you see, does it make sense? In this case, it doesn't. It needs to be me, so the answer here is C. So that's a case error. All right, so that was our pronoun errors. Let's move on to the next category, which is prepositions, which are like, for, above, with, those kinds of words. Prepositions and idioms, and these usually go hand in hand because certain verbs are going to use certain prepositions, and this is what we're going to see in these examples. Here we go. It was a Chinese-American grower who finally succeeded with adapting the now familiar orange tree to the American climate. So the issue here is this. Do you succeed with doing something? No, you succeed in doing something. Or even succeed at. But in this case, succeeded in adapting, or succeeded, would it be succeeded at adapting? Finally succeeded at adapting. No, I think it'd be in. Who succeeded in adapting, or who finally, you can change this in some way to make it less weird, but you want succeeded in. Succeeded with this does not work, so the answer here is B. And that's just an idiom, that's just an expression, right? That's just something you kind of need to know from knowing English. Alright, let's move on to 4. When the news spread how new gold fields were discovered in Nome, Alaska, thousands abandoned Dawson, the site of the previous gold rush. Here's another example of a pronoun error. Well, it's not exactly a preposition, but you get the idea. It's an idiom. When the news spread how? No, the news spread about. News spreads about something, not how something. So, let's get rid of A. B makes the same error. Here we go. We've got 3 choices that use about. Now we just got to pick the one that works the best here. And it's going to turn out that it's going to be E. When the news spread about new gold fields that had been discovered in Nome, Alaska, comma, thousands abandoned Dawson, the site of the previous gold rush. Boom. So E is going to be our answer here. So prepositions and idioms are just kind of expressions, ways of forming things in English that you just kind of need to know. They're very hard to memorize and learn, so I can't really give you too many specific tips about them, but just be aware that you want to look for these prepositions or these expressions and make sure they're being used correctly. Alrighty, let's move up to category 4 here. Pick a different pen color here. That looks good. Alright, category 4 is going to be sentence structure, and this is just how sentences are put together. Right? How are they written? Are the conjunctions right? Or are you using your and? Are you using your commas, your semicolons, stuff like that? So here's a couple specific examples of the kinds of sentence structure errors you'll usually see. And note, as you can see from the examples I have, you'll most often find these types of errors in the improving sentences. 6. To complete the music program, a student must present 1 vocal performance, 1 instrumental performance, and composing 1 original work. This is an example of a parallel error or parallelism problem. Parallel simply means that when you have a list, as you do in this case, they must be of the same form. There's got to be kind of rhythm to it. So put it this way. To complete the music program, a student must present 1 vocal performance, noun, 1 instrumental performance, noun, and composing 1 original work. This is a verb. We have a problem here, right? So maybe we would just get rid of composing and maybe just have and 1 original work, right? Or 1 original composition. No worries, either one would work here. And why would that be? Well, because look at the rhythm. A student must present one vocal performance, one instrumental performance, and one original work. And we can see that B is exactly what we want. The others are not going to fix that problem, or they'll make it worse. So that's going to be a parallel error. Let's look at number 7. Selected as an astronaut by NASA in 1990, over 719 hours in space were spent by Dr. Ellen Okoa on 3 flights by 2001. This is an example of a misplaced modifier error, and these are very hard to pick up because, or also dangling. I think dangling participle maybe. I call them misplaced modifier though. So these are very hard to pick up because we probably speak like this all the time, but when you look at them literally, you'll see that they're not going to make sense. Now, it hinges on this piece right here, selected as an astronaut by NASA in 1990. So this is a kind of introductory fragment that's going to modify whatever comes directly after it, after the comma ends. So we're expecting a person here, right? A person was selected as an astronaut by NASA, aka Dr. Ellen Okoa. What is it actually literally saying? Well, it's literally saying that over 719 hours in space was selected as an astronaut. That doesn't make sense. So we need to move this Okoa lady to the front, right after this introductory phrase. So let's see. A doesn't fix it. B makes the same kind of mistake, or just adds more commas and junk in there, no good. 3 flights doesn't fix the error. Now D and E both fix the error, right? Now we have Dr. Ellen Okoa, and we're going to see that the best choice here is going to be choice E out of these two. Because we don't have this extra comma here, we don't need it. We just got to go right into the subject of the sentence. So that's a misplaced modifier error. Those are pretty rare and they're hard to see, but it's an example of the kinds of sentence structure issues you'll see. Finally, 5. When the Berlin Wall, let me just pick a different color here. That looks good. When the Berlin Wall, a long symbol of the Cold War, began to be torn down in 1989, 5 million people went to celebrate that. Now, on the surface, it doesn't seem like anything is necessarily wrong, but this is an example of where kind of shorter is better. Shorter and more concise, more clean. 5 million people went to Berlin to celebrate that. Well, how about just to celebrate, right? They went to go celebrate this event, and that's choice C. Here's an example of it's just shorter, cleaner, more concise. The rest just add unnecessary complication to the picture. C is going to be the best answer that we can come up with here. Alrighty. Moving on to the next error category. This is a very small one that doesn't come up that much, but it's one that you should know, and it's noun agreement. And this is, as you might expect, all the nouns of a sentence have got to go together. So let's check this one out. 8. The old maxim, let the buyer beware, suggests that as a buyer, we are responsible for inspecting merchandise for flaws before paying for it. Well, here we've got a noun, right, as a buyer, and then we've got a pronoun we. It's almost pronoun agreement, but it's also noun agreement. Because we have a buyer here with we, and we is going to be probably right. If it's right, we need to have as buyers, or if it's as a buyer, we need something like, you know, you or I, something more singular. So this is actually probably a pronoun, but you get the idea, right? This noun, buyer, is going to agree with its pronoun. So let's look at the choices. As a buyer, we are responsible. That's wrong. As a buyer, it is their responsibility. Nope, that makes the same error right there. The buyer is the responsible one. Not great. The old maxim with the buyers beware suggests that buyers are responsible. Yep, that's good. And then E, buyers are the ones responsible. No, not really. That doesn't make any sense. So the answer here is going to be choice D. And that's noun agreement. That's not a great example of it, but realize that there are other examples that will use nouns. Maybe that one was more pronoun, but you get the idea, right? Pronouns and nouns and all that stuff should go together and work well. Final category is number 6, which is adjective and adverb. So, adjective or adverb. So let's take a look at 21. Not many authors have described the effects of environmental pollution as effective as Rachel Carson, whose work is still a model for nature writers. Well, let's look at this. As effective as. This should actually be effectively. Not many authors have described the effects of environmental pollution as effectively, right? This is an adjective in its way. It should be an adverb because this is modifying how well the author has described the effects, right? They've done so effectively. They haven't done so effective. They've done it effectively. And let's take a look at 24. In Angkor, Cambodia's ancient city, a clever designed reservoir, 5 miles long and 1 mile wide, supplied fish and helped farmers to produce 3 crops of rice annually. So here we have clever. Again, this should be cleverly. This should be the adverb form because this is modifying designed. And the general rule is this: adjectives modify nouns only. Adverbs, and they generally end in ly most of the time, will modify verbs. Adjectives, as it does here, right? Cleverly designed. Designed is an adjective in this case. Kind of a verb, but it's like a verb adjective. And they also modify adverbs. So an example would be really, quickly. Really is an adverb modifying this adverb, in this case, quickly. So that's an adjective adverb errors, and they will come up decently often. Now, there are some other errors I didn't get a chance to look at. They're very minor. I don't really want to put them in their own category, but they do come up. Those include kind of comparison errors, as an example. Yeah, that's about it. But these are the major 6. If you can learn these 6, you're well on your way to a really great score in this grammar section. Now, finally, let's look at a couple examples of the improving paragraphs questions. Now, normally you'd have this piece of the paragraph would be combined to this. It'd be one long passage, and then you'd have the questions after it. I just broke it up because I wanted to pick the parts of the passage that were appropriate for these questions. So what are the kinds of questions we might see here? Well, here's an example. What must be done to sentence 3? Well, let's go ahead and read this opening paragraph here. No one owns Antarctica. The nations of the world agree, some of them reluctantly, that all countries would share the continent for the purposes of scientific research. Governed by the Antarctic Treaty, written in 1959 and adopted in 1961, which has been signed by 27 countries. Another 17 countries have agreed to abide by the treaty in order to participate in research being done in Antarctica. Alright, so it seems on the surface there's an issue with this phrase, right? We're dealing with sentence 3. There's an issue here. The issue is that, let me just get my pen out. The issue is that this is kind of a fragment. It's kind of waiting for something to modify here, or at least should be changed in some way so that it's an independent clause. Now, let's go look at the choices here. What must be done to sentence 3? Here's kind of like almost like an improving sentences, but it's within the context of the passage. That's the key. Within the context. It's got to work within what the author is trying to say. So let's see. A, combine it with sentence 2, putting a comma after research. Well, let's see. The nations of the world agree that all countries would share the continent for the purpose of scientific research, comma, governed by the Antarctic Treaty, written in Because the question is that research really governed by the Antarctic Treaty? Not really. It's going to be Antarctica. But the problem is also that it's just kind of very run-on-y. It's not really improving it very well. You can leave it if you like it, but I'm going to get rid of it. B, begin it with words Antarctica is. Let's say Antarctica is governed by the Antarctic Treaty, written in 1959, adopted, which has been, yes, that looks good, right? That is going to fix it. Keep it in context, right? Antarctica is going to be what we're talking about. So in context, that's probably the best choice, and that's going to be the answer here. The answer here is B. Let's just look at the rest. C, replace the comma after 1961 with a semicolon. That doesn't fix our issues. D, place the words it was before written. No, that would be run on, comma splice, fragment, be awful. E, change 1961 which to 1961 period it. Nope, that would still not fix the problem. We would still have this fragment governed here, so we would have to change it more, so E is no good, and the answer here is indeed B. So that's an example of the kind of question you'll see in the improving paragraph section. Let's look at one more. Clear, let me just pick a pen color here. I don't know. How about that? That's ugly. This is good. Alright, the third paragraph would be improved if which of the following sentences were added. So now, this is what I mean by it's almost like a reading comprehension. We have to read this, figure out what they're trying to say here, and then pick the sentence that would best improve the author's position here, or best help the author express what he or she is trying to say. So let's read this paragraph. Clear decision-making has become a more urgent challenge as more tourists are attracted to Antarctica. Scientists living on Antarctica were not always as careful to preserve the pristine environment as they are now. Tour operators are working with treaty members to devise regulations, and there are plans to assess the environmental impacts of tours. But regulations and assessment plans may prove difficult to settle on and enforce in a place where jurisdiction is unclear. So here we're talking about tourists, right? The problems of having tourists come into Antarctica and all the issues that they bring. And this part is trying to deal with, okay, how do we deal with these tours? How do we regulate them, given that jurisdiction is unclear? So the answer we're looking for probably is going to have something to do with tourists. So let's see. A, scientists collect ice cores. Now, that has nothing to do with tourists, right? B, if the West Antarctica ice sheet melted, global seas. I mean, that's not terrible, I guess, because it's about the pristine environment, but not really about tourists, not great. C, it is the driest place in the world, not about tourists. D, one cruise ship encountered 30-foot waves. I mean, I guess it's quasi about tourists, but this is really talk about the problems that tourists bring. Now, this is the dangers to tourists. So let's look at E. Last year, more than 10,000 tourists visited Antarctica bringing soil boots, climbing gear, and trash. Perfect, right? This talks about the environmental issues of all these tourists coming to the area, so E will be our best answer here. All right, so that was a run-through of the grammar section, and this is the last video of the SAT Foundation series. Now, if you like this series, if you like this video, please rate, leave a like, leave a comment, leave a subscribe, or subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, please contact me. You can come to my site, recentprep.com. I'm going to have a lot more stuff there on the SAT and a lot of other stuff, a lot of other good stuff. So please check that out. And I hope you enjoyed this series. This is Rob signing out, and I'll see you next time.